Are there traits or strategies we can incorporate into our own day-to-day lives that can give us a better chance of financial success? Today we'll be attempting to find out which is the best by bringing you some top tips as we look more closely at why rich people end up rich. Welcome to this episode of the Infographic Show, Habits Rich People Have. Before publishing his book, Rich Habits, The Daily Success Habits of Wealthy Individuals, author Tom Corley spent 5 years observing habits of both the wealthy and of people living in poverty. He found there were significant differences in the daily activities and attitudes of the two groups. One thing Corley discovered was that the majority of successful people
destabilize countries and exploit labor.
This starts with a long and horrendous description of the kind that you're familiar with if you follow these things at all carefully, about some people who are living in a hideous camp with suffering from malnutrition and disease and children dying and all these usual things. And it goes on to describe how 5 months ago the Nicaraguan National Guard evicted them along with dozens of other peasant families from their seaside village. Today they live in huts made of rubbish in an empty railroad yard. The peasants and their sympathizers have protested their treatment to the Nicaraguan government and to U.S. officials who have expressed an interest in human rights, but they expect little assistance from either. And then comes a background information which explains why they expect little assistance. The peasants blame their eviction on the desire of Nicaragua's large landholders to acquire still more acreage in which to grow the high-priced long-fiber cotton that's the country's chief export crop. And it goes on to describe how there had been a land reform scheme, but it was abortive and it's been reversed, and how soldiers came to their village, loaded the peasants on trucks, dumped them in the rail yard, left behind all their possessions, such as they were. They've received no assistance, according to this article, except the menacing nighttime presence of armed National Guards troops, who occasionally prowl the outskirts of their encampment. They have no source of support. Thousands of peasants have been uprooted from their homes by the National Guard, and it goes on to interview peasants who say that they can't fight what the United States gives the dictatorship in weapons and aid, and describes how the U.S. donated weapons were used last week to put down a brief revolt led by leftist guerrillas in which 35 people were killed, on and on like that. Then comes the conclusion. In Nicaragua, the U.S. presence has continued to dominate the Nicaraguan view of politics, not the reality, it says here, just the view of politics. American economic aid is a major factor here. The National Guard continues to be supplied, as it has been since it was formed in 1933, with U.S. weapons. Its officers are trained exclusively at U.S. bases. Further description of how the Nicaraguans take for granted that what happens in that country depends on American whims. Well, let me come back now to Arthur Schlesinger. As I said, there is a sense in which his comment is quite correct about human rights replacing self-determination as our guiding value. He's correct in another sense, though not an intended sense, in suggesting that there's a kind of a correlation of sorts between human rights in some country and American policy towards that country. I don't know that the issue has ever been seriously studied, and it's not the kind of question that I would expect American political scientists to study. To my knowledge, there is only one effort to investigate a possible correlation between the human rights situation and U.S. foreign policy. Maybe there are others, but this is the only one I know. Namely, it's one that I was involved in together with Ed Herman, who's an economist at the University of Pennsylvania. And what we did as a sort of a pilot study of this question, we took each of these cases and asked the following question: how did the human rights situation change before and after this event? Studying things such as torture, murders, death squads, destruction of unions, that sort of thing. This set of measures, as far as we get evidence, and you often can. So that's one question. And second, we asked the question, what happened to American aid? How did American aid to these countries, military and economic aid, relate to these events? And we discovered that, in fact, human rights and American foreign policy are very tightly correlated. That is, there was an astonishingly close correlation of the kind that one rarely finds in the social sciences between an increase in human rights violations and an increase in U.S. aid, which is a very close correlation. Now, superficially, one would say, well, I mean, presumably, apparently, American aid is conditioned by a decline in the human rights situation. That is, if a country wants to get foreign aid, what they ought to do is start sending out death squads to murder peasants and carry out torture and so on and so forth. At least that's what the rough correlation would state. However, as you know, the social scientists among you are very well aware, one has to be very cautious about correlations. It could just be that each of these things is correlated with some third thing. And in fact, that's the case here. We also asked the question, how did what is generally called the investment climate change with these events? And it turned out that the investment climate changed favorably, that is favorably from the point of view of the outside investors, as the human rights situation deteriorated, and also that American aid increased, American support, diplomatic, military, economic support increased as the investment climate improved. In fact, so what we really ought to conclude, I suppose, is that the United States really has no policy with regard to human rights. That is, human rights in itself as an independent factor is just not an issue in American foreign policy or in the policy of any other state. I don't think that's terribly surprising. The rhetoric, what's surprising about the United States is the fact that the silly rhetoric that's produced is actually believed by people. But as far as the government and its policies are concerned, human rights is no more an issue than it is in any other country. But that there are factors that do relate to American foreign policy. For example, improvements of the investment climate in a general sense. You know, there's lots of factors entering into that. And that is surely a very significant factor in how American foreign policy is designed. That is, it will support countries that throw open their society, their resources, their land, and so on, in fact, their workforce, to the intervention of U.S.-based corporations. No doubt American foreign policy is strongly conditioned by that factor. And in fact, improvement of the investment climate is itself correlated with the deterioration of the climate with regard to human rights, and for very obvious reasons. I mean, if you want to turn, say, the Dominican Republic into a place which is, as described in the ads, you know, a sort of an economic miracle, a paradise for investors, and so on and so forth, then one of the things you have to do is make sure you do break up peasant unions and destroy labor unions and get rid of annoying leftists and so on and so forth. And the best way to do that that's ever been discovered is by introducing a murderous terrorist regime which carries out the kind of violence and destruction that I've described. When that is done, then the country is available to let the forces of the free market operate and to allow the penetration of foreign capital. And in fact, we do find that that's precisely what happens after the successful American interventions, either direct military interventions, as in the case of the Dominican Republic, which were simply invaded, or indirect military interventions, such as in the case of the Brazilian or Guatemalan coups. Not so indirect in the latter case, since American planes were actually bombing Guatemala, but still not an outright invasion. So what we can, if this pilot study turns out to be accurate, and I frankly have little doubt that it will, if it's ever conducted, if there is, if anybody conducts a serious investigation of this, I don't advise you to apply to your nearest foundation, incidentally. But if a serious investigation were conducted of this topic, I have no doubt that it would find that there is a dramatically close correlation between the deterioration in the human rights climate and the increase in U.S. support.